Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming along to what is going to be a fascinating and incredibly pertinent panel discussion on the future of UK-US relations. I'm Tom Nurcombe. I'm a senior researcher here at the Coalition for Global Prosperity. CGP exists to support a strong and comprehensive British foreign policy that brings stability abroad and promotes British security and prosperity at home in the most turbulent of times. Now, the world is in its most volatile and unpredictable stage in 80 years, with threats and challenges rising by the day. And in this era, alliances really are the UK's best form of security. And the National Security Strategy, which was released in June of this year, outlined that the United States remains the UK's most important defence and security ally, and urged greater cooperation in areas like defence technology and AUKUS to really cement this partnership. Now, the return of Donald Trump to the White House has undoubtedly caused a lot of concern across Europe about the strength and longevity of this transatlantic alliance. And it is in this context that we'll be discussing today how the UK can navigate the so-called special relationship, manage the risks associated with it, and secure the relationship during the Trump presidency and beyond. Now, joining me is a very illustrious panel indeed, who are more than capable of covering all of these things and more. On my far right, we have Mark Francois, the Member of Parliament for Rayleigh and Wickford, being first elected in 2001, and he is currently Shadow Minister for Defence. Throughout his parliamentary career, he has held several ministerial positions, such as Minister for Defence Personnel, Welfare and Veterans, and Minister of the Armed Forces, and a number of others as well. He also served on the Defence Select Committee from 2017 to 2019, and again from 2020 to 2024. On my immediate right, Sir Alec Shelbrooke MP, the Member of Parliament for Wetherby and Easingwold, and Sir Alec also serves as the Vice President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and is a Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. On my immediate left, we have Olivia O'Sullivan, who is the Director of the UK in the World Programme at Chatham House. Before joining Chatham House, Olivia worked for over a decade in international development and foreign policy in the government across roles in the Department for International Development and in the Cabinet Office. And last but by no means least, Stuart Anderson is the Member of Parliament for South Shropshire and has served as Shadow Armed Forces Minister. He now represents the UK in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, where he serves as the Vice Chair of the Science and Technology Committee on Defence. He is also currently studying at the Royal College of Defence Studies. And Stuart, I'd like to start with you. I mentioned at the very start that we are in a new era of global instability. It's more volatile and unpredictable than it has ever been since the Second World War. Could you give us your sense of where we sit at the moment in this era and all the threats and challenges that we are facing as a country today?
Yeah, and firstly, thank you for asking me to speak today. It's a pleasure to do this. So what I just want to add is 26 years of my adult life prior going into Parliament, I worked in security and defence as a soldier and within the security and defence industry. I got to see the highlights of Belfast to Baghdad. But I've never seen the world as volatile and completely thrown in the air as it is at the moment. And I want to explain why I believe that is. So last year, I believe, depending on which source, there was about 54 or 55 conflicts around the world, which is a number that backs up how it's unstable, because that's the most ever since the Second World War. And I believe we are seeing and living through a disruption of the world order. You can talk about a changing of the world order, but there is a disruption at this stage, meaning we do not know where it's going to go. And why are we seeing that? Because the two most powerful men in the world, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, both want the world to change on the current trajectory that it's going. So we do not know where that's going to land, and we have competing global powers at the moment, and there's a lot of complexities in that is shaking up the world order. So international rules-based order that everybody would talk about is, I believe, coming under the biggest challenge. So normally international rules-based order is where the largest country in the world sets the rules and makes sure everybody complies to them, but they don't have to if they don't want to. And I will back that up with Kosovo. You look at Libya, Iraq. There's times when that hasn't been followed. Now, when you are the largest country in the world by a significant amount, that is easy to follow. As we've seen with the rise of China, India, you've seen what Russia have done in recent years. All of that is getting thrown in the air. And in 1999, two Chinese colonels, I believe it was, both said that they would defeat the West in the future if there was ever a conflict, because the West would be constrained to the international rules-based order, and they would always operate outside it if needs be. So when you throw all of that in the air at the moment, we have a complete disruption to what the world order is, and that shifts what we would have seen as a Conservative Party, the importance of soft power, or actually coming from an empire, the legacy that we had of soft power around the world is dramatically changing. If you walk into a room and say that we are going to fund this aid project, people go, oh, that's very good. China have just put 10 times that amount into this country already. They've given us loans, or they've built roads or infrastructure. But also, if you're saying that you're going to fund an aid project when you've got people like Xi Jinping, Putin, Trump, that are all talking about hard power, that makes it very difficult for soft power to work on its own. And Poland's a great example of this. I think they're probably around about 4.7% of GDP spending at the moment. Me and Alec, who both serve on NATO Parliamentary Assembly, have seen them gone from a small sort of partner that's come along to a serious player in the room. And I believe that our soft power or our influence around the world is dramatically reducing because we are not correctly funding hard power. And that's what I wanted to set out as the opener of where we see a lot of the questions go today between NATO, UK, US relationships. We have to at all times, and as a student at RCDS, I would have to talk on the strategic overview, we have to look at the geopolitical situation around the world. And the world as we know it, I believe there is nobody alive that has experienced what it's like to operate in this current environment, and that's changing. So keep that at the forefront of your mind as we go through any other questions that we've got today. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Alec, President Trump was over in the UK just a few weeks ago on a state visit, and the government passed this off as a great success, but then a week later, Trump's at the UN launching a tirade against the UK and Europe over energy policy and taking a particular dislike to the Mayor of London. There are undoubtedly questions about what the future of the transatlantic alliance is, but what's your assessment, what's your sense of where this special relationship, so-called special relationship, where does it sit today? Are we on the cusp of quite profound change? And is it actually a case that we can call this relationship special anymore?
Well, I think we must take off our rose-tinted glasses when we talk about the special relationship. Words formed, Thatcher-Reagan relationship, perhaps? Well, Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada and didn't tell Margaret Thatcher, which she was not very happy about. Ronald Reagan refused to help us when Argentina invaded the Falklands, which Margaret Thatcher wasn't very happy about. So there is a close relationship, but let's not over-egg the pudding. That close relationship, though, is really important. And it's important because in terms of the weaponry we share, in terms of strategic analysis we share, you know, in Norfolk, Virginia, you've got the Atlantic Command. That's protecting the Atlantic, yes, but really Europe. You know, these are really important areas. So there is this brotherhood, if you will, intertwined. And Donald Trump says a lot of things. But he also doesn't do a lot of things. And in May, they passed the big, beautiful bill, which was the budget. Not 1 cent of American dollars was removed from the European defence budget. So I think that in itself tells you the story that the Americans quite rightly are very angry at the way, to be blunt, Europe has freeloaded off America for a very long time. In 2007 in Riga, George W. Bush said, Europe has got to spend more on defence. In Brussels in 2014, Barack Obama said, Europe has got to spend more on defence. Nothing happened. Then along comes Donald Trump. If you don't spend more on defence, I'm not spending it. And suddenly, I've been on the Assembly for a long time now, suddenly these European countries did an about circle and started to spend more. Then Biden gets elected. Wow, we'll start on this path, we'll carry on. And then Ukraine gets invaded. Now, at first, everybody was willing to put it in, and Biden was putting money in and putting arms in. And then our warehouses started to empty. Okay, well, we'll talk to the Americans. The Americans said, guess what, guys? Our warehouses are emptying as well. Okay, we need to start doing something about how we manufacture weaponry. The whole of the NATO alliance can manufacture armaments in 1 year that Russia can manufacture in 1 month. The whole of the NATO alliance takes 1 year to manufacture what Russia manufactures in 1 month. Let's think about that. I mean, that main reason is because we don't have an industrial base. There's one thing that the bean counters at the Treasury hate is billions of pounds of weaponry sat in a warehouse that we're never going to use, because that was really the thought. Cold War's been won. When we have to use this stuff, do we really need all this stuff? And we came into power in 2010. What did we do? Cut the destroyer program in half. Let's just take a little step back. What did Gordon Brown do with the aircraft carriers? Suddenly decided to change the launch system. How much money did that add to the bill, Mark? £1 billion?
Quite a lot.
Yeah, £1 billion. These defence has been a plaything for governments. Now, a lot of people say, and there may be a difference of opinion on this panel amongst the MPs, a lot of people say, well, the aircraft carriers are a waste of money. Now, I don't believe that's true for a moment, because aircraft carriers are capital ships, and they send a real signal. And one of the signals they send is that we are willing to send our most expensive, most advanced and capital ship, and the flagship, to the South China Sea to support a League of Nations, if you will, in keeping the sea lanes safe. Now, America massively appreciates that, because the Asian Pacific arena is getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and that mainly falls on the Americans. So the fact that European countries are willing to send some pretty heavy maritime kit to support the Americans is absolutely vital to what we may want to deem the special relationship. And we are sending our newest and most advanced ships to support that effort. And therefore America are perfectly willing to say, you're putting your shoulder over here, we will put the shoulder over there. It has to be a partnership. But as one very moderate Republican congressman said to me, why should the American taxpayer carry on subsidising the European taxpayer? And when we get to that position of respecting each other's taxpayers, then actually we can understand that what Donald Trump is saying is something we all would say if the things were reversed. And indeed, you could argue we do say about certain areas of spending. So I think the special relationship, however you want to deem it, will always be there because we're intrinsically linked partners. And of course, it is in America's interest to have a stable Europe. But let me just finish on this one point to give you something to ponder. It has never been in America's interests for there to be a very large and successful armaments industry in Europe.
Thank you very much, Alec. I think it was Finland's president that said that his strategy with dealing with the US would kind of be a reverse Kennedy approach. It would be ask not what the Americans can do for you, ask what you can do for the Americans. I think that's a really important way of framing this. But Olivia, let me go back to this state visit quickly. While it was deemed a bit of a success by the government, it did expose a number of diverging opinions between the Trump administration and our own government. Recognition of Palestine came up as a really important area of divergence, but there have also been things like multilaterals and climate change which have come up as well. Could you perhaps outline some areas where the UK and US might actually diverge in terms of opinions and interests, and do you think that these will actually cause problems in the long-term relationship and working together in other areas?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me on this panel. I feel a bit left out not being a Conservative MP.
You asked a really interesting question there, Thomas, because I think there's a distinction between differences in opinion and divergences in interest. And I think this picks up on exactly what Sir Alec was saying. All through the US-UK relationship, in the post-war period, there have been times when we've had differences of opinion. I mean, on Vietnam, on the Falklands. I think the very different and distinct question that we should be asking ourselves is, are our interests diverging? And what should the UK do about that? And I think defence has been highlighted really clearly here, in that America pre-Trump, and I'm sure post-Trump, has been making it clearer and clearer that they don't see their primary security interests in shouldering so much of the burden for European security and defence anymore. And we very urgently need a strategy for dealing with that. And part of that, I think, is the increasingly cross-party consensus, not all parties, but major parties, on spending more on defence. I think there is a big question about how we work with Europeans on defence, whether that's bilateral relationships with the other big European military players like France and Germany, or whether that is a closer defence and security relationship with the EU, not least to support backing that additional spending that the UK and other allies will need to do. But I think there are some other areas where we need to be looking out for. Is there a strategic divergence here? And I think trade is one of the other ones I would highlight. Again, to pick up on the theme that the rest of the panel have raised, we should be cautious to distinguish between times when Trump is being very bombastic and saying things, and and I think being quite careful about not reacting to everything he says, not reacting to everything that is the sort of flotsam and jetsam of American political debate, but looking very carefully at how, across parties in the US, the American attitude to global trade is changing. They're increasingly concerned about China's trade practices, increasingly going back to Obama, not wanting to work with the WTO as it currently exists in the same way. That poses some big questions for the UK long term about what kind of global trade governance are we interested in? What kind of trading relationships might we need to manage and bolster our resilience against a US that's much more inclined to use tariffs, but also a China that's much more inclined to use its economic dominance to sort of try to extract concessions from other states. And then, finally, I think we should consider the divergence on things like multilateralism and climate. Regardless of, there'll be a divergence of views in this room, there'll be a divergence of views on the panel. It is nonetheless, I think, significant that the US, having been the country in the world that was spending $60 billion thereabouts a year on what we might broadly call aid, but what we can consider also multilateral efforts to monitor things like infectious diseases, a lot of security partnerships with middle-income countries, strategic countries, places like Jordan are very exposed by that cut in US aid. Those countries have been hit quite badly by that, and also by US tariffs, and that changes that's significant, and that means we need to think about how might that change their orientation towards China. How might they see the US now as a reluctant multilateral actor in the world? What does it mean when a country that has sought to be a leader in these multilateral institutions doesn't want to do that anymore? And what might that mean for the UK's relationship? So just to highlight a few divergences that I think just raise long-term questions for the UK, rather than the sort of initial reacting to things that Trump says and that kind of thing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olivia. Mark, if I could come to you with an issue that I'm sure many people will be pondering at the moment, and that is the Chagos Islands. Mm-hmm. The US seem to have signed off on this agreement between the UK and Mauritius on the sale of these islands. How do you see the Chagos Islands playing into joint US and UK security interests? And do you think the transfer of these islands is actually a cause of concern for the future of the relationship between the UK and US, particularly as Alec mentioned, the importance of the Indo-Pacific going forward?
Yes, well, I'm not going to compete with my colleagues about President Trump's comments, but he was right about Sadiq Khan. On Chagos, we as a party have repeatedly raised this with statements and urgent questions, and we've made the point again and again that this is strategic madness. what we're being asked to do is to pay, we now know over time, £35 billion of British taxpayers' money in order to effectively rent back islands that belong to us in the first place. Now, at first glance, that's mad, and when you look at it in more detail, it's still mad. And the reason that we're being asked to do this is because we have a government of human rights lawyers, and they have accepted an extremist interpretation of international law that says that we might be at risk of a legal challenge over the sovereignty of the islands under the auspices of institutions of the United Nations. There are two key points to make on that. One, the International Court's opinion is advisory, it's not mandatory, and even if it were, when we signed up for the jurisdiction of that court some years ago, we had a very specific waiver that the United Kingdom would not be bound by any decision of the court that related to either current or past Commonwealth countries. So we've already basically got an opt-out from any decision of that court. The next level down is whether there is any UN institution which would, as it were, take as gospel a decision of the court, where we could lose on a point relating to sovereignty. Now, Labour danced around for months about what the real legal threat was. What is the thing we're paying 35 billion quid, to head off at the pass? And in the second reading debate on the bill to give effect to the treaty, they finally came up with it. And they finally said it's because we could lose a decision under the International Tribunal of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. But again, when you read the documents, under Article 298 of the UNCLOS Treaty, there is an opt-out for anything that relates to military matters. So in pub English, we got a double opt-out on this. One on the International Court, and then secondly on UNCLOS. So why are the government doing it? If you read the preamble of the treaty, it talks about decolonisation. You have a bunch of human rights lawyers in Starmer and Hermer and Starmer's mate Philippe Sands. They all believe that this is some colonial overhang and we've got to give it back. Strategically, this is madness. In the second reading debate on the bill, Sir Jeremy Wright, a very, very well-respected former Attorney General, basically demolished the government's legal case far more effectively than I've just attempted to do. So they're doing it, if you like, because of post-colonial guilt. And it's strategically bonkers. And I think they'll pay for it because, Labour MPs, when that bypass is cancelled or that extension to your local A&E unit isn't built, the first thing people will say is, well, you gave the money to Mauritius. So politically, this makes no sense. Now, in terms of the wider sort of geostrategic picture, we've heard a lot about the Euro and the Atlantic, so the Pacific, just quickly. I said to an American congressman a few years ago, why, with a war raging in Europe, are you still so obsessed with the Pacific? And he said, Mark, Pearl Harbor's not in the Atlantic. And they're very worried, rightfully, about the rise of China. And so it's very important that we had that carrier deployment. The AUKUS programme is extremely important between the US and Australia and ourselves, and we had some very good news last week. The Trump administration had reviewed their commitment to AUKUS. The issue is whether or not the new generation of submarines, the Israelis need 2 or 3 early Virginia class. Well, would the Americans maybe say, no, we've got to have them first? That review has concluded the US will remain committed to AUKUS. I mean, that is fundamental in terms of international commitments in the Pacific. I believe, even though it stretches our defence budget, it's very important still to try and be a power that counts in the Indo-Pacific. My last point is this. If you look at the Strategic Defence Review, and this is our greatest fear on it, there's a lot of good in it. It talks about speeding up and reforming procurement. And we support the government where we can, because to some extent defence is a bipartisan issue. certainly over Ukraine. But the fundamental flaw in SDR is its lack of urgency. It talks about, in the document, being ready to, if necessary, to fight and defeat a peer enemy in 2035. And that applies both in the Indo-Pacific as well as in the Euro-Atlantic.
Thank you so much, Mark. Let's stay on this theme of the Indo-Pacific, because I think it is really important, because the US has indicated that that will be its priority. You've got a number of flashpoints in that sphere, Taiwan being the main one, but also the South China Sea as well. Stuart, could I come to you about the UK's Indo-Pacific strategy? Now, the UK does have a NATO first, but not necessarily NATO only approach to defence and security. How do you think the UK should be playing a role in the Indo-Pacific?
I think that's a great question, and I'm 3 times in the last year I've been over on behalf of NATO to the US, and I sadly just had to take one to the team and spend a week in Hawaii with Pacific Command. So I was with 7th Fleet, and then I went to San Diego with 3rd Fleet. It opened my eyes beyond what I have ever seen in defence before, and I'm going to expand on what I mean for that. The Indo-Pacific is 100 million square miles with half of the world's population, and most of the largest armies in the world are based there. At the moment, China have the same number of ships or submarines in their fleet when you balance it out, maybe slightly more than the US military. Tonnage, the US military has more. By 2030, the US will be far outweighed in the Indo-Pacific, because China are doing about 200 ships or submarines to every one that the US is doing. By 2030, the Americans are openly saying that they would not have the sufficient capability to control China in the Indo-Pacific without coalitions. So they are looking at this more serious than they've ever been, just because of the Chinese industrial base. Now, I'm not talking about their ability to fight wars, because everyone goes back to Vietnam was the last time that they had a conflict. But they are currently growing at an absolute rapid pace, where they want to control all the waterways in the Indo-Pacific. And America are publicly saying they will not allow this to happen. North Korea have become more advanced. They're not a country that's just firing off missiles with no strategic aim. They are really understanding this and working in the region as well. So you've got the complexities. 3/4 of Russia is in the Indo-Pacific, although only 1/4 of their population is there. So you've got all these complexities. And now people are having to take sides. So Mark and I think it was 2022, did the AUKUS review in Australia. Mm-hmm. And at the time, this seemed such a massive project. And as Mark says, it's very important for what's the international, us playing a space, or playing in the international space over there. But it is like a flea on a dog's back when you look at the size of it. They are now putting permanent US military bases in Darwin, which has not been done before. Mm-hmm. They are now having permanent military bases in the Philippines. All these are opening up because sides are having to be taken. You are falling one side or the other. So there is a very serious play for what's going to happen. Now, I know that whereas Trump has said, you focus on Europe, we'll deal with the Indo-Pacific. What he initially says and what happens can be 2 different things. He's first getting us to invest in Europe. We definitely need to do that. And when we went there, and I had a brief off the Admiral and the whole of the Pacific Command, the people that are running the operations over there, they have the UK Carrier Strike Group, the US and the Japanese. They have them there together, and look at that. That's a good display. But we visit. We go over there. There are 76,000 US Marines based there alone in the Indo-Pacific. That's bigger than our military. We will, HMS Spey is the only thing that we have over there, permanently based over there, I believe. We will occasionally send troops to do joint exercises. We will lose some of these skills for operating in those environments. When as a soldier, if you went to Arctic training, you have to familiarise and do that. For us to be a serious player in the Indo-Pacific, and I believe this would give us more hard power than any other single decision we're looking at, if we were to grow the UK military by a brigade strength, which is 3,000 to 5,000, give or take, depending if it's infantry brigade mixed with artillery or drone capability, permanently base it in the Indo-Pacific, because you will have the ability to rotate that through, we will have more hard power than any other single thing we can do, and the US would bite our hand off to do that. Outside of that, we are playing in that domain, and I believe that will be where we'll see a major disruption, and by 2027, China want to be ready for whatever comes ahead, and everyone says 2027 they're going to take Taiwan. That's not what they've said. They will potentially be ready to take back any areas that they believe they have a claim. In 1800s, Russia took some of China. They also have a claim to Russia. So there will be potential conflicts further down the line there as well. We are observers at the moment. AUKUS gives us a foot in the game, and the carrier strike groups gives us credibility. But to be a serious player, we have to expand our military by at least a brigade strength to be able to go in that domain. We could not even consider putting a battalion there and rotate them through, so 6, 12 months, whatever that looks like, on the current military strength.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Some really important points. I mean, the US has been pushing allies to really stand up to China a lot more in that sphere, and clearly that's something that we need to be looking at as well. Olivia, you mentioned aspects of soft power in your opening remarks. Now, the US has, over recent months, kind of gone about dismantling a lot of its soft power strategic assets. Obviously, USAID was pretty much shut down and now is being rolled into the State Department, but also stuff like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia have been shut down as well. Do you think that some of these decisions by the Trump administration are actually going to harm UK interests in the world, and US interests obviously as well, as we enter into a new era of multipolarity and as China and Russia get more influence across the world?
Thank you. I think this question often gets framed as if it's a sort of hard power versus soft power question. And actually, I think, frankly, sometimes it is, because resources are not limitless. And I think there have been decisions in European countries too, including in our own, to make some tough choices on defence spending, to cut aid budgets in order to do so. And that the UK is not alone in that. France, Germany, others have been thinking about that too. I think the US's decision on USAID is much bigger order of magnitude. It's really, really significant to shutter USAID altogether and to step back from this sort of what has previously been, I think, a part of their wider strategy. So we hear from Chatham House, from officials in lots of different countries, including in the Indo-Pacific, and sometime one of the things we heard around that period when USAID was shutting down, but also when the tariff policy was particularly confusing, you get folks from these smaller countries in the Pacific asking us, do you know with the US's policy? Is our aid comes from the State Department or USAID? We've got a military agreement with them. What's going on? And we also hear other officials from other countries say, we are in a difficult position here and we would like to know on which sort of economic security development partner we can rely. And I think it is just worth reflecting on that. It's not for us to say what the US's strategy should be, but it is worth saying that we get smaller countries in what we've all identified as a strategic region saying to us, we are confused about what they're doing. They're not communicating with us what they're doing, and this kind of double impact of the tariff policy and the cut-off of aid, which for some countries is very significant. It's not important for huge numbers of countries in the world. So I think we must assume that has an effect, and I don't think it's as simple as saying China is the obvious alternative for those countries, or that China is going to fill that funding gap. There's all kinds of other considerations that they have. But I do think we should think carefully about how does that affect the way those countries see the US and its role. And is there anything the UK can think about? We are not going to we don't have the same interests, we're not going to act in the same way that the US did. But on some of these soft power questions, are there things we can be thinking about in terms of information warfare? Are there things we can be thinking about in terms of things that have been historic strengths for the UK? And are there ways we can really think about prioritising some of the most strategic countries that have been hit by that sort of inconsistency and volatility in US policy in what is a very competitive world with other people seeking hegemonic positions?
Thank you so much. Olivia, we've covered the Indo-Pacific. There is another area of growing competition between what is regarded as the West and what is regarded as this new axis of autocracies. And Alec, it's a particular area of interest of yours, the Arctic region and the High North. How do you think this region is actually going to play out in terms of this great power competition? How important is it? And does the UK actually need a new approach to dealing with the Arctic?
Well, it is going to be one of the major arenas over the next 30, 40, 50 years. No doubt about it. You could, if you Google NASA Earth ice view, you get a live update every day of the ice cover over the Arctic and over Antarctica. You also get a line of the historic maximum of the ice on that day and the historic minimum of that ice on that day. What is noticeable is just for how long now the Arctic Northeast Passage is ice-free. And I think that what also has to be recognised is the sheer size of geography. I think, people look at a map and, the old joke about it was only that far away on the map, and that's about 6,000 miles. I don't think people do recognise the geography we're talking about. What is also undoubtedly true is that there is an enormous amount of hydrocarbons under a seabed which the UN has declared cannot be touched. But does Russia care about that? It's also in a territory that is deemed to be UK territory. So again, what do you do if the Russians go along and start drilling our territory, breaking the UN protection of that area, plus on our land? What are we going to do? How are you going to protect that? It's not got a huge amount happening in it at the moment because it is a big area. It takes a very long time to sail a ship from the Bering Straits through to the North Sea. A very long time. And there's nothing to support you along the way. That, first of all, means that you're not getting any insurance. And second of all, means if there's any trouble, you're doomed, and people don't want to do that. There's no infrastructure on there. But it is being built. And if you want to have any doubts put aside of just how much trouble Russia are in, Russia never let China into the High North. Now, China are always in the High North and Russia aren't. And China are investing in that Russian coastline to build things. So, what does this mean in terms of us and NATO and the countries around it? Because remember, there are 7 countries up in the Arctic and 1 Russia. But Russia's got the biggest coastline. It means we've got to invest more in maritime. And this is where you start to get the real strains on how we balance this out. Stuart has pointed out very eloquently what we need to do with the army. We know that just in recent events that we desperately need to make sure we have a functioning RAF, that they've got to be able to protect our airspace, especially with Russian jets buzzing all the time. And Donald Trump is absolutely correct when he says you shoot down a Russian jet if it is invading your airspace. You know what? August 2015, Turkey did it, and there's never been another Russian jet in Turkish airspace from that moment on.
17 seconds.
Yep.
It was in Turkish airspace for 17 seconds. They issued one warning and then they shot it down. They never came back. Never came back.
So you got it there. But ships. Now, there's probably a bunch of people in this room who thinks, is there really going to be broadside, ship-to-ship combat? Are we really going to be in those areas? Well, Mark, Stuart and I will recall very well 5 years ago being told there's never going to be a tank war in Europe. Why are we spending all this money on tanks? Mm-hmm. Well, that got well and truly proved wrong in a short space of time. This is a really important arena that is opening up for all of the traditional reasons that a war may be fought. And the lessons are not history books, they are the last 3 or 4 years. Now, let me make a recommendation to all of you. Just go away and Google Putin essay, July 2021. It's not a long read, but it's all there about what he wants to do, and that should terrify everybody. And what you've got to remember is deflecting where attention is to achieve your objectives elsewhere is a well-known military tactic. Most of the Russian fleet, which is a very advanced fleet, and it's very well manned and it's very professional, is up in the Arctic Circle. So if you want to draw the attention of NATO allies away from things in Europe, let's start something up in the Arctic Circle. Let's start something in the High North. Let's draw our attention up there. Let's make sure that your resources are going to have to be spent on maritime and not on land and not on RAF because you're going to be tied up there. It's a mix. And that's where you then run into your problems to expand of how we're going to pay for this. Okay? Let me ask in here, it's a bit of audience participation. Who thinks we need to be spending 4 or 5% of GDP on defence? Okay. Who's willing to stand up and say you're going to cut 3% of the NHS and get rid of the triple lock? That's a slightly different number, isn't it? Well, we've already spent that this week. The reality is that I don't buy into 3, 4, 5% in GDP. I buy into what do we need. What do we need to defend? If that comes out of 4%, 5%, if it comes out of 7%, so be it. But this is where this government are the biggest security threat this country has faced in years. Because we need to build things to be able to protect us, protect our allies. And the way we do that is to have a growing economy, to be able to get more revenue in, and to be able to spend it on the things we need to spend it on to secure us. And all this government has done is destroy our economy. It's not about 4%, 5% targets. It's about what do we need. And what we need is writ large across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. So actually, when we look at the actions that are going to happen at the end of November, when we look at the actions that have happened thus far, what the Chancellor of the Exchequer is doing, what the Prime Minister is doing, they are putting our national security at threat, as well as just our everyday lives of economics. And that is a message we've got to get out to people, because you know what? You might think this is fun labour and saying and playing your ideological games about we shouldn't have the wealthy, we shouldn't have the rich. We had a debate just before the summer recess, and one of my colleagues said about the rich being driven out of the UK, and a Labour MP shouted out, good. Now, that tells you everything you need to know about this Labour government, okay? So let's be absolutely crystal clear what we're talking about. It's not about percentages. It may calculate at 4, 5, 6%. Mark and I have done debates even when we were in government saying we've got to increase our defence spending to 5%. But what we've actually got to do is deliver what's needed. And the High North, I'm afraid it's not sexy at the moment. It's not what people are thinking about, but it is absolutely going to be one of the major arenas in the next 3 or 4 decades and needs to be taken as seriously as we're taking about all the other things that we're talking about today.
Thank you.
Can I just come in on a final quick point?
A
very quick point on that. As Alec said, you'll see, and Mark would probably come with a similar thing for some more funding in another area. The first rule of government is defence of the realm. Never in my adult life has that ever been funded correctly as it should. The conversation needs to be around what should the government do, not what can the government do. Until we start having that conversation, we will not be able to fully fund defence.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm going to come to you, Mark, just quickly before having a quick round of audience questions. This issue of China really comes into American policy and also UK policy to a lesser extent, but the UK has been quite ambiguous about what China is. Is it a threat? Is it a challenge? Is it an economic opportunity? How do you think that the UK's approach to China is actually going to impact the relationship with the US over the next decades?
Well, look, this government, to some extent we were guilty of it too, but this government is schizophrenic over China. And they're desperate for economic growth, so they don't want to offend the Chinese for fear of damaging any trade prospects. That's why they still won't take a decision on this super embassy at Tower Hill, which is madness. Yeah. But they haven't said yes, but they daren't say no. And there'll be more about this in Parliament, so I'll choose my words carefully, but it is looking increasingly murky when we look at why this Chinese spying case was suddenly dropped. So I would just say I suspect we'll be hearing more about that in Parliament next week. As Stuart says, it is not the declared policy of China to invade Taiwan by 2027, but it is, Xi asked the Central Military Commission to give him the capability to do that. Now, in order to do that, you would have to build a whole bunch of amphibious shipping. They're building everything that they would need. And 90% of the Western world's high-end semiconductors come from that island. If we lose those chips, it will take years in order to be able to replace that capacity. That is one thing Trump is now trying to do actively in the United States. So I think we have to understand that NATO's most powerful ally, our strongest ally, is very concerned about the threat from China, but I think we need to be concerned about it too. We've talked about the AUKUS program, the GCAP program, Tempest, the new 6th gen fighter. Who would have said 5 years ago that we'd be developing that aircraft with Italy and Japan? But we are. It may be now that some other countries are going to join that program if what we read in the press is correct. So we have lots of links in the Indo-Pacific, and I think we need to understand, even though we may sometimes be frustrated by American commitments to Europe, we need to understand why the Americans are so driven by the risk of the threat in the Pacific. That said, when we had these 19 drones that ended up in Polish airspace, that wasn't a mistake. I mean, 2 or 3 of those drones could have gone astray, not 19. We were being tested. And I was really encouraged that the US ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, came out later that day after an Article 4 discussion and said that the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory, full stop. That is the most unequivocal commitment to NATO that I've heard from the Trump administration. So all is not lost on that front either. But at the risk of hammering the nail, the Americans are really worried about China and the Pacific, and they have reason to be, and we need to understand that as their friend.
I think this message of all is not lost with the Americans is a really important one that we all need to take away. So, questions. I'm going to take a few. So, the gentleman straight there with his hand right up, first of all, and then we'll be coming
Thank you very much. Simon Forthorpe from Orpington. Quick question. You've discussed sort of everything around the world almost, but you haven't discussed space and space warfare, not a single mention of it. Is that not potentially missing something out completely from the whole strategic way that we defend ourselves in the future?
Thank you. And the gentleman right at the front here, there is a microphone just coming.
Thank you. Tony Johnson and Cheadle. I'd like to inquire whether the panel feel that something should be done about the recolonization by China of so many countries. And I have recently, last month was in Central Africa and Zimbabwe and Zambia, and clearly there is an increasing influence there, and the standard of work is poor. I was obviously disappointed that the railways had really not been maintained, and copper and from the Congo and Zambia was going by road. The roads were being rebuilt, but looking at with help from the Chinese, but looking at the sub-core.
I'm going to have to cut you short. I'm sorry. We haven't got that much time, but China's influence in Africa, we get it. Beatrix, thank you. So, Stuart, space assets.
Yeah, I like how everyone looked at me and said space. No, it's actually a really valuable point. And we looked at this quite heavily in the Defence Committee a couple of years ago, and I remember saying to my wife, this is like Star Wars, looking at it of how this is another battle space. So when I talked about the international rules-based order, that's based on an international set of rules that has been established for many, many years. There is nothing in space. How do you currently define this? And we could set out, or the US could set out what they believe a set of rules to play by, and China say no. China are potentially winning one of the races there in space at the moment. And when Alec spoke about the Arctic, you've got Svalbard, that island there that we both went to. That is probably single most important communication point in the world because 14 satellites pass over it every 24 hours. Nowhere else in the world do they go over that same amount. So it basically, in the equator, you're looking at 3 or 4 passes. So that gives you about 90 minutes you can see anything on the planet. So that's why it's so important. 2 data cables go from there. One was previously cut by accident by a Russian fishing vessel. But in that space now, there is no regulation or ability to be able to oversee all of this. And most of in the low, near Earth orbit, low Earth orbit, is pretty much Elon Musk's satellites over there that are now creating a system around the world. One of the first things I believe in any global or major conflict we would see attack on satellites or an electromagnetic pulse to take out things like GPS. And most, if you look at the aircraft carriers, they have a digital system and they have the old analog wind-up where you can just use a system that was there in many places before. The problem that we've got with this is trying to regulate and play by a set of rules where nobody else is going to play by those rules. It's posing more questions than it is answers, and when we've sat down and looked at this, we've sort of got to the conclusion that it's so open, it's so hard to regulate, and the space race will be over who can put the most up there and protect the most things. So you will start to see weapon systems in space that protect major key satellites. When you start looking at some of the defence stuff that are very costly, very timely to put up, they go a lot further up into orbit. They're easier to protect, but it's just an absolute minefield of different satellites that are getting put up a rapid rate of knots. This will open up, whereas we've talked about Indo-Pacific and Arctic, this is a whole battle space on its own. I don't believe the battles will be fought there, but they will be definitely targeted and have strategic things that will remove the ability to fight as we can. And one thing, I did a sniper course in the Army many years ago, and you learn on cam and concealment. And when we sat in the Pentagon, he said, I can find anyone in 90 minutes on the planet. He brought the US Special Forces in, proved it to them, and he found them. So it just throws out all those tactics where you thought you were looking, you were hiding away. But there's so much that they can see now, it's changing the ability to fight. And I would much prefer to fight on the ground with having the ability to see me in every aspect from space.
And this question about China's influence in the global south, the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth, Alec.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent we're trying to bolt the door after the horse has gone. But there are areas which are really important and we're not taking notice of, and I think this is a NATO responsibility, even though it's perhaps in the Pacific. Talk about renewable energy, talk about battery technology. If I was to ask people in here, you know, what metals are we talking about? You'd mention lithium, you'd mention cobalt, you'd mention boron, you'd mention those. Nobody ever mentions copper. And you cannot have renewable energy without copper. You've got to get it from the battery to the motor. Now, we don't manufacture enough copper now, and we need double the amount. Biggest copper deposits in the world are in Chile. It takes 15 years from striking a copper mine before you produce anything useful. Now, China have already got into Peru, but they're not in Chile. So where do the interests lie? You know, we have to get back into these areas. We should learn the lessons of what's happened in Africa, where the Chinese went in, started investing and got them signed up to things when we weren't even looking at it, and make sure that we don't allow that to become a complete world domination. Currently, 90% of all renewables that have been processed come from China. You know, you'll hear the Labour Party go constantly on about we cannot be reliant on hydrocarbon dictators. And that's why we've got to rush ahead with net zero. You ridiculous toys, you don't know what you're talking about. If you want to burn gas and oil, we need to switch that off tomorrow because the wind's blowing, all the lights stay on, it's fine. Because we must be on these dictators. So I asked the question in the Commons to the Minister. I said, is China a dictatorship? She wouldn't answer it.
Yeah, I was there when you did that.
Yeah. Absolutely refused point blank to answer it. This is Kerry McCarthy. She would have literally been screaming at us from the back benches if we hadn't have answered that question. But they can't bring themselves to say that China is a dictatorship. And yet, We can't use hydrocarbons. We've got to renewables because of dictators. But don't worry, even though we're now totally reliant on China, they're not a dictator. They literally describe themselves as a communist dictatorship. This is a nonsense. So, in answer to your question, we have seen what happens when the Chinese get the foothold in. We can't get them out now. Those countries are there. But there's a hell of a lot of other places around the world where the Chinese aren't, and we need to stop them getting that same foothold. We need to learn the lessons.
The lessons are we are financing the...
Sorry, we really don't have time. I'm so sorry. Mark,
So,
do you want to talk about potential... I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to stop you, please. So we've covered space assets. Is there anything else we've actually missed as well? In terms of areas that there will be a competition between the West and this new axis of autocracies. Is there anything else that the US is actually looking at that is really important that we haven't actually spoken about?
well, my father was a D-Day veteran, and unfortunately died when I was 14 years of age. But he was on a minesweeper that day. I've got all his naval papers and everything. He drummed into me, even as a young boy, never take living in a free country for granted. I mean, I think that probably it's a long story, but that's really why I came into politics. And we face a variety of threats. Space is a very good example. But in all of the so-called 5 domains now, land, sea, air, space, and cyber. And those threats are only intensifying. And hence my earlier comment that it is worrying that Labour don't seem to have a sense of urgency in the way that we should. If I make one simple example, I was in Poland recently. The official policy of the Polish government is to prepare for war. They'd rather deter it, but to prepare, if necessary, to fight a war with Russia within 3 years. And that policy is already 6 months old. They've just ordered 1,000 main battle tanks from South Korea. They just ordered 500 heavy artillery systems from South Korea. They've just ordered a brand new air defence network from us. So, the further east you go, unsurprisingly, the more seriously they take the threat. You've only got to go to the Baltic states. So we really do need to wake up. In Putin, we are dealing with a former KGB colonel. He is not a Boy Scout. His readings, as has already been highlighted, make very clear what he intends to do. He is not a madman. He is not clinically insane. He just has a totally different value system, I hope, from everybody in this room. And history shows us again and again and again that we take the security of our nation and our allies for granted at our peril. Putin is going to keep coming. And if we don't stop him in Ukraine, we'll have to stop him in the Baltic states. And if we don't stop him there, we'll have to stop him in Poland. And by then you're into something that looks very much like World War III. So this, I think, is the context in which these sorts of debates are taking place. And that is why on the Shadow Defence team, we're doing a defence review of our own, but we're going to do it in opposition, because we've taken one decision, and if you forgive me, this is important. If we come into government in 28, 29, we're not going to have a defence review, because we can't lose a year whilst everything goes into the deep freeze and the MOD won't take a decision. So we're going to try and do that review in opposition. Now, it hasn't been done this way for a long while, but we're going to have a crack at it. And if any of you have any suggestions for things that you think that should incorporate, please email into this and we will give them proper attention. So we're going to be ready if no one else is. Thank you.
And Olivia, we've got very limited time left, so could you give your overview at the end here?
In the 30 seconds remaining, I think I'll just say one thing, which is the title of this panel is about the UK's relationship with the US, but we've actually spent a lot of time talking about countries other than America, a whole range. And I think that just demonstrates that when the global hegemon changes and shifts, whether that's to focus more on China and the Indo-Pacific versus their traditional heavier role in European security, whether that's changing their attitude towards multilateralism, towards trade, it means that powers in the position that the UK is in have to start thinking very carefully about relations with other countries and start boxing quite clever. And I think thinking about the whole range of levers that we have, whether that's offering different trade relationships to some of those countries, that are increasingly intertwined very closely with China due to debt and China's influence in the global south, whether that's thinking about new partners that we need to invest in together on defence and old partners, including Europeans. I think it opens up a whole range of new foreign policy questions that we need to ask.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I'm afraid we're going to have to close the panel there because I've run over once again by a couple of minutes. Luckily for those of you who are interested in what the UK-US relationship should look like over the next couple of decades, we released a report just 2 months ago on this specific issue. It can be found online, so please do give it a good read and please give your feedback if you're inclined to do so. But for the time being, will you all join me in thanking our really excellent panel today with a round of applause?